In this video I'm going to be bringing in two Illustrator sections into Photoshop, then I'm going to be adding some ground, sky, people, and trees. So I've got my two sections here, and then I've got Photoshop open, so I'm just going to drag both of the sections right from the Illustrator files into Photoshop. Then when the import PDF box, I'm just going to click OK for both of these. I'm not going to change the image size because then that'll change the scale of the objects. So I'm going to click OK for both of those. So then I got my two documents open here. So one way of getting this layer into the other file is if you right click, you can go to duplicate layer, and we're just going to switch the document to our other file. So that should put that other Illustrator document into this. And now we're going to go ahead and set up the page size. So from image, canvas size. So if your units aren't set already, you can set them to inches, and we're going to set this to 17 inches wide by 11 inches tall. So with my two objects in, I'm going to set the top one to multiply so that it shows through to the object underneath. So I can see the two objects here, and it doesn't matter which layer is on top of each other if they're multiplied, because it'll still look the same. If I select second object, multiply it, drag it above the first, there's basically no difference. So now I'm going to set up some guides that we went over in class. So I'm going to make some guides at 2 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches, 7, and 8. Then I'm going to make one more just in the middle at 8.5. And with both of our layers selected over here, if you hold down Shift, that selects multiple. You can also use Control. If you have, say, 3 objects, Shift will select all 3 of them, but if you can use Control to select different ones that are not right after each other. So select both our objects. I'm just going to bring them down a little bit. You can use your arrow keys to move objects up or down, like in really small increments by pixels. So you can move them up, maybe 1 or 2 pixels left or right. And it looks to be center, but I'm just going to double check. I can move it out to the side, and then when I go back it should lock. The guide should turn pink, and that'll show you that it's lined up horizontally. So now that we've got our guide set up and we've got our objects positioned, I'm going to make some folders so we can hold all of our layers in them, and it'll make organizing them so much easier. So I'm going to start by making a new group for our AutoCAD files, and I'm going to call this base files. And if you select a certain amount of layers on the layers panel, then click create a new group, that'll actually group the layers that you have selected. So that's another way of, like, instead of making the group and then moving the layers in, you can select the layers and then press create a new group, and it'll group them all together. So I'm going to call these base files. And I'm also going to make a few more groups. I'm going to make a sky, a ground, people, and trees. Now for the order, we want the sky to be in the back, then the ground, then the base file, and people and trees. It can sort of be either or. So I'm going to start by bringing in a ground, and I have some earth and dirt textures here, and I'm thinking that, let's try this texture right here. I'm just going to drag it right into Photoshop. And then if you have a high enough resolution texture, you can usually scale it up like this, but I think the scale of the dirt is a little out of proportion if I make it this big, so I'm just going to shrink it to roughly half the size. And going to just drag it down here. Then I'm going to make a duplicate of this layer. I can either go over to the Layers panel, right click, and click on Duplicate, or if I just hold down Alt, I can drag this layer out and it'll make a copy. So I've got my two layers there. So I'm going to select both of the ground textures and I'm going to drag them into the ground folder so that they're in the right folder. And I want to apply a gradient fill to that. So with my ground textures in place, I want to create a solid fill layer so I can give a little more color to the ground. So there's two ways of doing that. The first is going to the Create a New Adjustment layer, and I can click on Solid Color. So I'm going to select sort of a dark brown. And then we need to create a clipping mask with this so we can apply it to the two objects. So first I'm going to select both of the ground textures and actually merge them together so that we can have our ground or solid fill as a clipping mask to this. Then I'm going to right click and go to Create Clipping Mask. You can also hold down Alt and then click between the two layers, and this will clip the color fill layer to the gravel. So with that clip, so now this is only applied onto this object. Then I'm going to come up to the blend mode and change that to multiply so that our solid fill will show through to the gravel behind. And I might bring the opacity down just a bit so it's not too overwhelming. So once we got our ground in place, it's time to put in a sky. So I've got my sky image here. I'm just going to drag this into Photoshop. It looks like it fills the page. I'm just going to bring it down a little bit so that it actually comes down to the horizon. Then I'm going to take that sky and drag it down to the sky folder so that it's behind the ground. That looks pretty good. So once we've got our sky position, I want to apply a gradient fill just to sort of fade it towards white once it gets to the top of the image. So with our sky layer selected, we can go into the adjustments and go to gradient. If we double click on this box next to the word gradient, this will bring up sort of your options here. Really, you could just select one of these like presets here, then we'll change it from there. So our bottom pickers here are the color and the top is the opacity. So both the bottoms will want them to be white. And then for the opacity, we want the right to be 0 and the left to be 100. Actually, so in this case that was reversed, so I'm just going to swap these so that our top is the most white and then the bottom is 0% opacity. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to click OK again on this, and I'm just going to bring this down in opacity so it's not whitening too much of our sky. So now that we've got the sky finished, it's time to move on to some trees. So I'm going to go find some tree textures. I'm going to just drag a few trees into here. So you turn my guides back on so I can see how big they are in relation to the object. Looks about good. We'll drag in a few more. So I've got my trees in. I'm going to make sure to move them up into the trees folder so that we can keep everything organized. And in this case, like I had all the trees actually behind the ground before, and that in this case might have worked better because it makes sense to have like the stem of the tree or the trunk tucked behind the ground, so I'm actually going to drag it back behind there so that it's coming in behind the ground, not in front of it. So with the trees in there, the left one here is the most faded, and this one here is pretty dark, and then these two are pretty bright. So I want to do some adjustments just to make them all the same in appearance. So I'm going to open up my trees folder, and I'm going to start with this tree over here, which is a little bit too dark. So with that tree selected, I'm going to make a new hue saturation layer. I can also get to that down in this menu here in hue saturation. I'm going to right click and create clipping masks so that this is only applying to this tree. And I'm just going to bring the lightness up a bit, maybe bring the saturation down to try to match that tree on the left. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the trees on the right. Let's make a new hue saturation. I'm going to clip it to the tree below. And I think this is as light as the object on the left, so I'm just going to bring the saturation down. And I can actually copy this. If I hold Alt and drag this down, it'll actually make a copy of that adjustment layer. And I can again clip it to this tree on the right. Just going to bring the saturation up a little bit. And another thing we could do is we could set the layer of the trees to multiply, so that it will sort of show what's behind it. So with on the tree group or folder, with that selected, you come up to here and then click on multiply. So you can kind of mess with different options to kind of get different looks. And then we could also drag the opacity down if you didn't want them to be as visible. So now that we've got our trees in, it's time to move on to some people. And when dragging people in, you sort of want to pay attention to how big they are compared to the object and the trees around them. And I should actually drag these into the people folder, and then any new people that I drag in should show up in the people folder. Just a quick tip: if you say bring something in and you want it to be like it's facing the wrong direction, when it's in the free transform, you can actually right click and you can flip it horizontally, or you can flip it vertically, and you can also rotate in different directions. Alright, so with our people in there, again, we could do something like we did with the trees. We could bring the opacity down if we didn't want them to stand out as much. I think that looks about good. And then just as a bonus, we'll throw some birds into there just to give some life into our render. I'm actually going to make a new group for that. I'll just call it birds. I'm going to set that to multiply so we can show a little bit of our sky behind, although it's hard to tell if it made any difference in this. I'm just going to drag the opacity down so it's kind of faded in the background. Alright, so that's pretty much all the steps in doing a basic section in Photoshop. There is a few other things you can do just to make it look a little bit more realistic. And one of them is with this ground right now. It's this like straight line, and it looks kind of a bit weird of how straight it is. So one thing we can do is make a mask and use that to kind of rough up the edge of the ground. So with our ground, I'm actually going to apply a mask to the whole layer. So with the ground folder selected, if you click over here, and this will say add a layer mask. So clicking that will apply a layer mask to the ground. So how a layer mask works is that it's basically another layer that's attached to either another layer or a group, and anywhere in that layer that's white will show the object, but anything that's black will hide the object. So you can see here with our layer mask next to the folder that the whole thing is white, which is pretty much showing everything that's in this group. But if I switch my color to black, and I'm actually going to go get my paintbrush tool here, so make sure that we're on the actual layer mask. So click on this white box and you'll see these sort of four corners come up. Then I'm just going to paint black on this layer. And you'll notice that it's actually showing what's behind that object as I'm painting black. And as I paint through this, you can see the layer mask down here is actually reflecting that black that I just drew. So this is a way of hiding or showing something without actually deleting the layer. Like I could actually go into the gravel layer, get my eraser tool, and then just erase this. But if I do that, it's gone. There's no way of getting that back. But with a mask, the original layer is always there, and you can just turn the mask on and off, and you can adjust it with the black and white, either with like the brush tool, or you can use the marquee tool. So I'm going to jump back to that layer mask, and I'm going to get my brush again, switch it back to white. I'm just going to paint this in so that we get our information back. So with my paintbrush tool, I'm going to shrink the size down a bit and make sure my background color or foreground color is set to black. I'm just going to bump up the flow a bit. Actually, I'm going to set it at 100%. Then I can use my brush to kind of trace along the edge here, but I'm doing this not with a whole lot of accuracy so that it has some kind of roughness to it. Basically, I just don't want it to be a straight line so that it looks more natural. So if I turn my guides off and zoom out, you can kind of see the difference between the left and the right side, how the right looks a little more natural because nothing is straight in the real world. By doing that, my tree is a little bit above the horizon, so I'm going to select that tree and just nudge it down so it's behind the ground again. So that concludes the end of this tutorial. In my next one, I'm going to be talking about some more specific tools in Photoshop that'll more help you with like overall skills instead of working on a specific task.